Of course I think we can win, and I'm fighting every single day to win.
We've now put forward a plan that... Is that bird worrying you?
Yeah. They're afraid of us. They can see that our movement is growing.
Well, you're not going to have a stand in the Parliament.
Let there be 1,000 lessons learned as far as I'm concerned.
This is the 4ZZZ Break the Election podcast for the Queensland state election in 2024. Hello and welcome to the 4ZZZ Breaks the Election podcast, just 11 days from the 2024 Queensland state election. My name's Alexis Pink, I'm the news coordinator here at 4ZZZ, and joining me today are...
I'm Sophie.
And I'm Bella.
From our 4ZZZ newsroom. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
In this podcast, we'll be bringing you up to date with the election and breaking down what is being said and why. Let's start with some breaking news. The Queensland Doctors Association has distanced itself from political advertising from the Liberal National Party over the so-called patients tax. Dr Nick Yim from the Australian Medical Association of Queensland has said the advertising by the LNP on the patients tax is not published by them and they do not endorse any specific political party. They also reminded people while there is no new tax, current tax law would lead to an increase that may have seen the end of bulk billing. Both Labor and the LNP have committed to exempting GP clinics from payroll taxes following a ruling relating to contractor structures commonly used by clinics. Dr Yim followed up by saying the commitments by both parties to address this were welcome. So why is this story important? What really stands out here? Bella?
Obviously, taxes and bulk billing is something that affects everyone in Australia, and that's something that's really helpful for all of us. So yeah, I guess that's interesting. I also think it's interesting how the parties have been using advertising to plot against each other and the use of the medical association, even though they are not wanting to be associated with either party.
There is something to be said about that in particular. Certainly the AMA likes to stay as politically neutral as possible. Obviously, there's a lot of complications being involved in supporting specific political parties. And the way that comes out is in the way that the patients' tax is being displayed, specifically the LNP saying that it is effectively like a new patients' tax, but it's not really that. It's a little bit more complicated. It's a ruling specific to the payroll tax, and that's not always evident looking at their work. Should we move on to another one?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, let's move on to the next story. What do you got for it, Sophie?
So, researchers warn that Brisbane may face a homelessness crisis during the 2032 Olympic Games, similar to Paris if it fails to address its social housing shortage. A report from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute published today shows how hosting the Olympic Games impacts the host city's housing situation and homelessness. Q Shelter, a non-for-profit organisation, commissioned the report and intends to publish annual reports leading up to the 2032 Olympic Games. Jackson Hills, Q Shelter's policy and strategic engagement manager, noted that previous Olympic Games had increased homelessness due to population growth, infrastructure investment, and heightened media focus on affected suburbs.
So, intersection of two pretty big stories during this election, the housing situation in here in Brisbane and the rest of Queensland, as well as the 2032 Olympic Games. Yeah. So, Sophie, why is this story important?
Well, obviously with the Olympics in Paris being kind of recent, I think we've been able to see how they've sort of dealt with homelessness. Obviously, homelessness is a huge issue in Paris. We were discussing this earlier. They kind of shoved it aside rather than tried to fix the issue, kind of tried to hide it, I guess. I think it's super important that it needs to be addressed because in the past, I think it was like in the 50s or something when there was some, like the games in Melbourne, they turned the Olympic Village into like a housing for the homeless. I do think it's really important because obviously it kind of ties in with the cost of living crisis and housing prices rising. So it really does affect everyone.
So it is quite interesting watching the political parties play this out.
Yeah.
Both the LNP and Liberal Party have committed to the Olympic Games with all of its faults and flaws and have been talking pretty strongly about housing policy in general, although maybe the Labor Party more than the LNP. But on the other side of that coin, you've got the smaller parties like the Katters and the Greens saying that support for the Olympic Games isn't necessary, especially when we need other services. The Greens especially hitting on housing, but the Katters really big on infrastructure problems in northern Queensland. Bella, how do you think this is going to play out if we get to a point where smaller parties and the major party have to form coalitions to make the next parliament work?
I think that's a bit of an interesting question. It's obviously difficult because I think those smaller parties are emphasizing, a lot of the public think that there's lots of other issues like homelessness, cost of living, that money should be going to instead of investing it in hosting the Olympics.
So do you think that the major parties will be receptive to those sort of negotiations?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's really hard to say.
Yeah.
Like, they've been pretty supportive of the Olympic Games in general. It's hard to imagine how they would shift their focus that quickly. All right, Bella. Last story, what have you got for us?
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has stepped into the Queensland state re-election campaign for the first time, as he joined Premier Stephen Miles at a campaign stop on the Gold Coast yesterday. While both Labour leaders set out on a ride on the Gold Coast light rail, there were no new funding announcements during the visit. Albanese took the opportunity to praise the Premier, despite his previous comments about the former federal coalition government, stating that no government gets better in its fourth term. The visit marks 10 days since Peter Dutton, the federal opposition leader, made his first and, to date, only appearance alongside David Crisafulli in Carindale.
So there is a lot to be said about federal and state government relations, and certainly having them on the same page helps, but there are different priorities between levels of government, and just being on the same political page doesn't necessarily mean that the priorities for the federal and state governments will align naturally. That comes up a lot in infrastructure funding, and it's certainly come up a lot in this campaign around doctors and GPs, because while states have control of major hospitals and secondary and tertiary care, the federal government controls a lot of primary care things like GPs.
Right.
And that is the big question around patient tax and things like that. So yeah, a lot of complicated interleavings there. And that's all the time that we have for 4ZZZ Breaks the Election podcast today. For more updates, you can find us on 4ZZZ in our morning bulletins, Brisbane Line on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at midday, and make sure to catch the Pineapple Rebellion at 9 a.m. on Fridays. If you want to support the project, subscribe to 4ZZZ at 4ZZZ.org.au/support. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll be back tomorrow. Goodbye!